and welcome to Bad Bookclub, where I, Jade, a silly goose with an English degree, read classic and popular literature so you don't have to. Hello friends, and welcome to our wrap-up on Where The Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. I'm really excited to get into it with you because I think the second half, labeled The Swamp, Part 2, is where we start to get into more nitty-gritty stuff of the novel, and then I'll get to the ending and I'll get to tell you my thoughts about that because I think I have the most thoughts about the ending. Today I'm just sitting in my new studio with a glass of water and a candle lit and hoping that I don't spill anything, and holding my little giraffe stuffed animal because he's really cute and I found him while I went home this weekend. 10 out of 10 would recommend going home and hanging out. It's really fun and relaxing. And yeah, that's just a little mini life update for you. There you go. Let's move on. Let's hop into the swamp and see what's going on with Kaya. Are you ready? I'm ready. Let's go. We open part 2 in 1965. Kaya is now 19, and she's on the beach, and we have another moment where Chase and his friends are also on the beach, and she hides. And again, she thinks of how jealous and sad she is of having girlfriends and friends in general. And while they're hanging out and all those groups of friends are playing, Chase sees her in some sort of hidden bush and meets her eyes, and it's weirdly intense, and they both look at each other. And neither of them do anything. He goes back to hanging out with his friends, and she's just thinking about him. So the next day she goes back to the same spot on the beach, but he doesn't come. So she's like, okay, well, maybe I just imagined some strange connection then. She doesn't say that, but I'm assuming that's what she thinks. And then she has this cute scene where she is rolling in the waves, and she'll roll towards the beach and try and guess whenever the waves will touch her. It's I think that this little paragraph is supposed to tell us that Kaya is having some sort of an inappropriate but sexual awakening now, because it's kind of weirdly erotic. So I think it's supposed to open the pathway into telling us that Kaya is now 19 and she is now interested in dudes, and Chase is here, and I think there's a feeling that hovers at the beginning of this part 2, okay? That's all I'm trying to tell you. So anyway, she goes to jump-ins one afternoon, and Chase is there. So he must know she goes to jump-ins, and he asks her if she wants to go on a picnic with him, and she says, okay. And she quotes a poem to herself by Amanda, I think Hamilton. I'm going to read it to you. Okay, ready? Trapped inside, love is a caged beast, eating its own flesh. Love must be free to wander, to land upon its chosen shore, and breathe. She mentions that poem actually makes her think of Tate, not of Chase. So speaking of Tate, we go into his, not perspective, because this is third person, but his little moment in time where he didn't meet Kaya on the beach. He mentions that he had come in early on July 3rd and watched Kaya from his boat. And he had watched her on the beach, and she was doing her normal Kaya thing. And then another boat kind of went by, and he saw that she freaked out. She saw this boat, and she hid in her own boat and hid there for a really long time, and was obviously really nervous and uncomfortable by this boat being near her. And it says that Tate had this moment where he realized that their worlds are just too different, and he's he panicked, and he was sorry, Kaya, and he turned around and left and didn't meet her on the beach. And so we just learn why Tate left her. To be honest, this book has such an ominous feel because while we're reading Kaya, we're also reading this murder investigation into Chase Andrews. And it just feels so ominous that I kept expecting one of these characters to die. So I was honestly surprised that Tate was still alive. I thought he died in some tragic accident because I think Delia Owens writes suspense very well. And so I was just expecting him to die. She almost outdid herself. I was oh, he's alive. He hasn't died in a fiery car wreck, because it's just so, to me, ominous. So it was just interesting. I kept expecting him to die. Anyway, the next day, she goes on a picnic with Chase. We're back to Kaya now. And they walk on the beach, and he's kind of a quiet dude, but also I don't know, they're just walking along, and he has a harmonica and he has like a nice boat, and they talk about the shells, and he picks up a shell and gives it to her, and she's like, thanks. And he lays her down, and he tries to basically get with Kaya. And Kaya panics. She's like, oh, no. And she gets up and panics, and he's like, oh, sorry, Kaya, like, sorry, it's okay. And she's like, she doesn't say anything. She just stares at him. He's like, I'll take you home. Like, it's okay. Like don't go. And she like just stands up and walks away. He's like, Kaya, you're like miles from home. She just keeps walking. And in the book, she says that she was feeling something, like she wants to do things, but she says that felt more like a taking rather than a giving or a sharing, quote unquote. So obviously she just felt like he was trying to take advantage of her, and she just wasn't for that. And he apologizes in a way that feels sincere to me, but she just obviously had enough of that event and left, which is pretty funny. So it's still 1965, and on another day, she sees Chase and his friends again at the beach. He sees her also, and he says, like, sorry, like, please don't go again. I really am sorry about that one time. Why don't we go to the old fire tower? Yeah, you know, the fire tower where he died? Let's go there. Well, not died, but dies in the future. Let's go to the fire tower. She gives him a necklace that she made from the shell that he handed her on their last time at the beach. And she acquiesces to go with him to this fire tower, and they climb up, and it's really tall, and she finally sees a view of like her marsh where she's lived for a while. And they decide, he is like, okay, let's go to your house. And she's like, I don't know. And it's one of those things where she's really private and he's like kind of barging in. But like, he's like, yeah, let's go to your house. And they go to her house, and he sees her big collection, and he doesn't get it. She's like, yeah, this is my collection. He's like, but why? And she's like, just cuz. And he's like, why would you, he doesn't say this, but in his head, he says, why would you collect things you could just see outside? It's clear in the writing that Chase doesn't see any like use of the marsh other than it's like, you know, uses for him personally rather than its beauty, unlike Kaya. So they're obviously different people. And she asks him, like, please be honest with me. What do you want with me? And he said, well, I'll be really honest. At first, I just wanted to sleep with you. Like, I wanted to be the guy that slept with the marsh girl. But after hanging out with you, I've gotten really interested in you as a person. So why don't we just see where it goes? And this part's a little slimy, I think. He's not a very, like, nice guy. Is a little slimy because she's like, what do you want with me? And he's like, I don't know, we'll just see where it goes. What do you think? I wanted to sleep with you before, but now anything's on the table. And it was like really meh. But to Kaya, this is like a moment of hope where someone is interested in her and she might have a future other than one by herself. So she, I think, clings on to that when I personally think she should not. But we all know better because we know that Chase Andrews doesn't end up in a good place, and we're all curious about how this story is going to end, right? Like, what's going on? Anyway, let's flash forward to 1969. Chase's mom comes into the sheriff's station with some news. She says, look, when I was seeing his body at the morgue to identify him, he was missing his shell necklace. And at first I thought it was just an evidence, but I got the effects and it's not there. So it's this shell necklace, and the marsh girl gave it to him because he eventually confessed to me that they had a thing back in the day, and he's always worn it. And the sheriff and his friend, Ed, go and decide to talk to Kaya at her marsh in 1969. And they show up at her house, but her boat's gone. So they assume that she heard their car and left because she obviously is not a fan of people. I think we know that by now. And so they're like, well, dang, at least like eventually we could get a warrant and maybe look at her house, but we have to go right now. So they left. Back to 1965, Chase obviously doesn't get the marsh like we were talking about. And she kind of fake laughs at some of his jokes, which makes her uncomfortable because she doesn't like doing that. And she mentions that when she sees Tate around the waterways, you know, around her little marsh, she just watches him. She's seen him a couple times. Then she describes another time she hung out with Chase. It's like just little blips in time. She describes how they're on a boat and he's playing harmonica and she's with him, and a porpoise comes up to their boat and she leans forward and sings to the porpoise, which is like very cute, and I'll read it to you. The next day, as Chase and Kaya cruised north along the coast, 4 porpoises moved into their wake and followed them. It was a gray sky day, and fingers of fog flirted with the waves. Chase switched off the engine, and as the boat drifted, he took out his harmonica and played the old song, Michael Row the Boat Ashore, a yearning and melodic tune sung by the slaves in 1860s. as they rowed boats to the mainland from the sea islands of South Carolina. Ma used to sing it while scrubbing, and Kaya sort of remembered the words. As if inspired by the music, the porpoises swam closer and circled the boat, their keen eyes fixing on Kaya's. Then 2 of them eased up against the hull, and she bowed her face only inches from theirs and sang softly, "Sister helped to trim dat boat, hallelujah. Brudder lend a helping hand, hallelujah. Ma, fader gone to unknown land, hallelujah. Michael row the boat ashore, hallelujah." So it's really pretty moment in the scene, and it's like a nice moment that they share together, which is cute. And then that night, while they're hanging out and they're kind of cuddling, he asks if he can kiss her, and she nods, so he kisses her, and she is happy in that moment. You know, there's like the sea in him, and it's just a moment of being with another person, which she really values. After that, there's another blip in time where Tate is also in these waterways, and he sees Chase and Kaya see each other one day, and they circle their boats around each other, and it's very cute, and he feels just regret. Like, Tate, despite his actions, his sections show us that he's still a good guy. He just made a mistake, right? Like, everyone makes mistakes, and Tate just messed up, and he feels a lot of regret, and he feels happy that Kaya's found someone, and he's like, it could have been me, but I messed up, right? So it's just a little moment. We switch back to Kaya, and she mentions that she gets tired of waiting on Chase. Like, she doesn't want to sit around her little shack and just wait for Chase to arrive. That's not how she wants to do her life. So she goes to their reading cabin for a while, and she reads this section about bullfrogs, and it's called Sneaky Fuckers. And it describes how some males are sneaky fuckers, and they will sit near a bullfrog that makes really macho sounds so that the females think it's coming from them, and that they'll get with the females, and then after a while, even though they tricked these females, it turns out that they live their life like alone, and it's kind of a sad life. And it's not very subtle, in my opinion, because I think everyone in the reader knows that Chase is not a good guy, and I think that this is very clear that this is supposed to be referencing Chase and how he's kind of a poser. But she thinks of herself in his life, being with his friends, being happy. And I think the thing that appeals to her about Chase is that he represents kind of a normal life that she could have with people who like her and who want to hang out with her, and she'll get to have that circle of girlfriends she's always been jealous of. Maybe it's not Chase that she likes so much as what he represents, which is the town and a normal life, which obviously appeals to her. There's another scene after that where she's hanging out with Chase, and he again tries to go all the way with her, and she again says no, and he says come on, we've been together for forever, and she's like, no, I'm just not ready for that. And then she goes into town one day to buy, I think, some cake for his birthday or something, some sort of cute thing for Chase, and she sees his parents at the Piggly Wiggly, and she tries to smile, and they just completely avoid her and ignore her. And when she sees Chase next, she asks him, do your parents know about me? And he's like, oh, yeah, but they're awkward, and don't worry about them. And she's like a little worried because she thinks, can you hear my cat? She's so mad that she's not in here with me. But anyway, she's just a little upset, but she lets it go, because they're together and whatever. And she's not seeing the red flags because she is so appealed by this life, and it mentions that the town is kind of gossiping about them, but no one really knows anything, so there's not much to talk about. Flash forward to 1966. If you're tracking it so far, which you are not required to because I'll do it for you, Kaya is now 20, and they've been together for almost a year now. Which is honestly a long time, longer than I expected Chase to be with Kaya, but I think it's definitely because Kaya still hasn't slept with him. So he mentions, when we get married, we'll get a house here, and she perks up at the phrase married because it implies that he really does want a future with her, and she's like, oh. And then after that, in that conversation, he says, hey, I have to go to Asheville for work. Do you want to come with me? We can get a place and see the city. You've never been there. We'll do it together. And she's obviously nervous, but they go. And the next bit is them driving to Asheville, and Chase is talking, oh, aren't the houses so beautiful and pretty and interesting? And Kaya is kind of sad because for the first time in her life, she's left the marsh behind, and she's seeing all these houses, and she mentions she sees flamingos in someone's yard, but it's those pink plastic flamingos. And she's like, oh, and the lack of nature and the beauty of the land is not there. So she's kind of saddened by it. And they get to a motel that night and Chase is like, Kaya, it's time. And she's like, okay. And, they sleep together for the first time. And she mentions that it's not that great. And she goes to bed thinking of the neon vacancy sign of the motel, which is just kind of a haunting image that I think implies that she did not have the best time at this location with Chase. Some time passes and Chase avoids making Christmas plans with her. He's like, oh, I have a family plan, but we can have Christmas afterwards. And she's like, okay. And she's kind of sad because she's like, aren't we supposed to be getting married? Shouldn't I be spending Christmas with your family or with you? And shouldn't we be doing more things like that? But he's like, oh, no, they don't want to do that. Life is here, not in town. Don't worry about it. And it's very interesting. Anyway, he is gone for Christmas. She spends it by herself and he's gone for a couple days after. And one day Tate drives by. And she's expecting Chase, but it's Tate. It's Tate in his boat. And she immediately starts throwing rocks at him. She's like, what are you doing here? Get out of here. I don't want you here. She's throwing rocks at him. And he says, look, Kaya, I'm so sorry. I understand. Please, I know why you're mad. And she's just throwing rocks at him. And he says, look, I just want to talk to you, please. And so they sit together for a little bit and he goes inside to her house and sees her collection, which is huge. And he's like, Kaya, you should write a book. You have so much information on the marsh. It's insane. And she's like, I don't know. I don't really want to. It's for me. And he's like, please consider it. Let me put you in touch with a publisher. And she's like, okay. And it is kind of an awkward conversation because Tate is there to ask for forgiveness and in general, to warn her for a moment about Chase. And she says, look, Chase is bad, but you're worse. She's not into that. And I think she says that because Chase is someone she's not in love with, but she knows that Chase can't hurt her because she's not in love with him. She doesn't expect anything from him, but she wants a life. That's what he can give her. And she's good with that. Tate broke her heart. So obviously to Kaya, I think he is worse. And he leaves and they're both kind of sad, but I think it was nice of Tate to stop by. It's a nice scene and nice to know that he's still kind of in love with Kaya, which is sweet. She says she spends New Year's with Chase and she has this kind of haunting line about how when he's playing harmonica, that's when he has the most soul, which there's just so many red flags about Chase at this point. Obviously, he's not interested in spending the holidays with you. He took you to a motel for their first time together and it's just not going well. I think she should break up with him, but she's one of those people who have never experienced anything before and he gives her so much and he gives her an escape from some loneliness that she's just willing to look over all these things that she sees for herself that she doesn't like. Flash forward to 1969. The Sheriff Joe and Ed talk to this guy named Hal, who mentions that Hal saw her in a boat that night, on her way to the fire tower on the night that Chase died. He saw her at night. It was definitely her, he says, driving toward the fire tower. Ooh. Okay, back to 1967 now. So it's been another year. She and Chase have been together for a while now. And she goes to town. Oh, I'm sorry. This is when she goes to town for groceries for Chase's birthday cake. The last one was just for regular groceries. So she's in town for groceries for a birthday cake for Chase. And while she's walking, she sees Chase with his arm around a girl. And she is so weirded out by that. She's like, excuse me? She walks up to their friend group and Chase is like, oh, Kaya, and drops his arm really quickly. And his friends walk away and she's like, hey. And he's like, hey, I'll see you later, and doesn't look at her and walks away really quickly. And she's like, huh. And she buys her stuff and she's kind of weirdly buying the things. She's like, why am I buying this stuff? And she goes home and on the way home, she buys this newspaper and inside there's an engagement announcement in the paper for Chase and that girl, Pearl. So it's a Pearl Stone wedding. And she is like, oh my God, he's literally engaged to somebody else. She is just sitting on her kitchen table what? And she hears his boat coming. So she leaves her newspaper on the kitchen table and runs out of her house and hides. Chase gets there and she watches him walk into her shack where she knows he'll see the announcement and then watches him come out and drive out into the sea. And she's like, oh my God. And she hops in her own boat and drives out into rough waters. She goes into there's some description of the Gulf Stream. And I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know anything about currents or Gulf streams or where she is. And so it's whatever. Basically, it's rough waters. And she's like, and water's getting over the boat and it's getting really rough and she doesn't feel anything. And eventually she feels some sort of fear and is able to drive herself onto like a little island and just kind of mourn the life that she's had of rejections. Like she even mentions to herself that she's not even upset about Chase. It's more about like how she just keeps getting rejected by the town, by Chase, by Tate, and she just can't seem to be accepted by anybody. And she's just sad. And she realizes that nature has never abandoned her. And she quotes another poem by Amanda Hamilton that I'll read to you now. I must let go now, let you go. Love is too often the answer for staying, too seldom the reason for going. I drop the line and watch you drift away. All along you thought the fiery current was your lover's breast, pulled you to the deep, but it was my heart tide releasing you to float adrift with seaweed. To be honest, I'm not going to bother with, looking too closely into that poem. I'm assuming it's mostly just that it's about a poem about letting go and realizing what you thought wasn't what you thought. So anyway, it's nicely written and it's obvious that she has a lot of Amanda Hamilton poems. Let's move on to 1968. Kaya is now 22, and she has had a book on seashells published. She got it because of Tate, because Tate, gave her that idea and set it up for her, and she can finally fix up the place. She has them come in and add electric and working water, and she's so excited. And she realizes that there's been some developers in the marsh lately, and she wants to make sure that the land that her shack is on is officially her land. So she goes into the courthouse and checks, is this my land? She brings her Bible and tells them, look, I've lived here for a long time. Do I own the land? And they say yes. But unfortunately, you have back taxes. And she's like, how much is it? It must be a lot. And he's like, well, it was around $5 a year, so it's $800. And she's like, here you go, and slaps down $800 with her royalties that she's gotten. And she's so excited. And she sends a letter to Tate telling him, look, I've got a book now. It's because of you. Please come by and I'll give you a copy. And he comes by and it's really cute. He's like, oh, I'm so proud of you. It's a gorgeous book. And we, the reader, hear from Tate's brain that he has already purchased a book, but he wants another from her. And she gives him one and he goes, oh, please inscribe it. And she inscribes it to the Feather Boy from the Marsh Girl and gives it to him. And she gives a book to Jumpin', which is the cutest little moment that I'm going to read to you. An hour after Tate left, Kaya motored to Jumpin's wharf, another copy of her book tucked in her knapsack. As she approached, she saw him leaning against the wall of his weathered shop. He stood and waved to her, but she did not wave back. Knowing something was different, he waited silently as she tied up. She stepped up to him, lifted his hand, and put the book in his palm. At first, he didn't understand, but she pointed to her name and said, I'm okay now, Jumpin'. Thank you, and thank Mabel for all you did for me. He stared at her. In another time and place, an old black man and a young white woman might have hugged, but not there, not then. She covered his hand with hers, turned, and motored away. It was the first time she'd seen him speechless. She kept on buying gas and supplies from him, but never accepted a handout from them again, and each time she came to his wharf, she saw her book propped up in the tiny window for all to see, as a father would have shown it. Which is so cute. I love Jumpin', and I wish that they would have hugged, because why would she care that much about race? Because she lived in the marsh for forever, but it's still so adorable. I love their relationship. I love that he's definitely a father figure in her life. It's just so adorable. It's 1969, and the sheriff comes in telling his, partner that he has found out that Kaya has an alibi. Apparently, he went to Jumpin's to ask him some questions, and Jumpin said that Kaya was in Greenville meeting with her publisher at the time. And Tate chimed in and said, yes, I can also verify she went to her publishers and spent the night in Greenville. She was not here that night. Both of them are for it. And the sheriff and his friend both talk about how oh, did Tate get with her ever? And they're like, no, I don't think so. He just taught her how to read. They're friends. And they still haven't been able to talk to Kaya this whole time. And then another woman comes in named Miss Patsy and mentions that she saw Kaya waiting at the bus stop at a certain time, and she saw her leave, and then she saw Kaya come back the next day. So Kaya seems to have a very strong alibi. The men are suspicious, though, and they wonder if she could have come back in the middle of the night, like gone to Greenville on a bus, come back, killed Chase, and then gone back to Greenville on a bus. That's what they're curious about. So they're going to go get bus schedules and see if they can prove it. And they think that that is enough for a warrant, so they're going to ask a judge for one. It's 1968, and I believe that Kaya's 23 now. Delia Owens stops telling me how old she is and just starts telling me the year, so I'm just going to start doing that too. Presumably she's older and she's in her 20s now. Anyway, Kaya hears a knock at the door, and she's like, oh dang, who is it now? And she goes out and sees this man standing there in a war uniform with a scar on his face. And she has this flash to a memory of Easter, when her mom dressed them up and painted eggs and stuff, and her dad, drunk, got mad that they had spent this money on Easter. And he backhanded her mom, and he grabbed a poker and hit Jody, her brother, across the face with it. And Jody fell to the floor and was bleeding, and her mom grabbed Kaya, and they ran outside to hide. She has that memory and realizes that this person standing at her doorway is Jody. It's Jody, and he was a soldier in Nam, he explains, and he saw her book, and he just had to come and see if she was still here. And he is so nice. He says that he is so sorry because when he was a kid, he was a coward, and he never should have left her. Kaya is really forgiving, and she says, you know what? You and I were both victims, right? So you're forgiven. And Jody has some really sad news. Their mom died 2 years ago. Apparently, after she left, she went to stay with their aunt, and she just was broken. She was mentally ill, physically ill, and she died of leukemia, and she never forgot them, though, because Jody has with him some of her paintings, and she's painted all of the kids together, and Kaya doesn't remember a lot of her sisters, but Jody's able to point them out to her, and they talk about their siblings, and it's so cute. It's a really great scene, and there's one painting that her mom made of her and Tate when they were younger, and it's very cute. And Kaya and Jody talk about how she thinks her mom should have stayed. She thinks that while Jody left because he was a kid, that her mom had no excuse, and she should have stayed for Kaya. And they finish reminiscing, and they just sit together. And he says, you know what, Kaya, I think you should forgive Tate, because she had mentioned what had happened. And he said, look, that happened a long time ago. I think you should forgive him. And it's something that comes into her brain. 1969, Ed and Joe, the sheriff and, his friend or the doctor, whoever it is, search Kaya's shack because they have a warrant now. And it's actually really adorable because Joe's super interested in her collection, and Ed is like, stop being distracted by the collection. He's like, yeah, but did you know, like, look at these shells, how fun. And it's actually really cute. But unfortunately, they find a red hat in her closet. Now, eagle-eyed listeners, because that makes sense, will remember that in my first podcast, one of the pieces of evidence they found was that there was red fibers on Chase's jacket. And so they found this red wool hat, and they think that could match. It's a wool hat, so it could be. So you guys, I don't know if you've noticed, but I haven't given you that many of my thoughts on the actual investigation because I don't want to spoil the ending for you. I think it'll be more fun in the podcast if you're following like a reader where you don't know what's going on. So I'm not going to tell you my thoughts till we get to the end. But I do think that at this moment, I was very concerned as a reader because I was like, what? Like, they found a hat, and it is a red wool hat, and there are red fibers on his person. And I don't remember ever hearing about this hat. So my interest in this story is as high as it's ever been because I'm like, oh my gosh, like now I really need to know what is going on because they've searched her shack. Like, I need to know. And we're about to get there. Are you guys excited? We get another 1969 in the investigation moment where they finally get the lab report back on those fibers, and y'all, they match. They match. So I really need to know what's going on here, right? Like, don't you? But the fibers match. The hat was on his person when he died, right? So that's not good. And then another guy comes in named Rodney, and Delia doesn't tell us what he says, but he has a conversation with Ed and Joe, the sheriff, about what he saw the night Chase died, and they go, now we have motive. And I'm like, what? They have motive for Kaya, apparently. And they say, okay, we have motive. We need to arrest her. How are we going to do it? We're going to have to trap her. So 1969, still this timeline, still like the future one. Kaya drives up to, by the way, this is the first time we've gotten Kaya's point of view. It seems really confusing in the book, and it kind of is, but in the book it's easier to read than it is for me to tell you. So just keep in mind the book is not that confusing. Anyway, Kaya motors up to jump-ins, and instead of standing up like he normally does, he just shakes his head very slightly, and she realizes something's wrong. So she tries to boat away, and instead the sheriff's boat and another boat like block her in so she can't leave, and she thinks about just jumping out of the boat, but she doesn't, and they read her Miranda rights. It's 1970, and Kaya has spent 2 months in jail. So I'm like, what? What the heck? I can't believe we're just going to skip over the part that I'm most curious about, which is like the night. But I assume that we're going to hear more about it as we go. But anyway, now we have some court scenes. We have some information about her lawyer, Tom, who like gave her a book on shells so he could get to know her better. And he seems really cool, came out of retirement, pro bono, whatever. And she mentions, the courthouse is just like the marsh, like the ocean. And to be honest with you, it's a bit rambly. Delia Owens tries to take her descriptiveness about nature to a courthouse, and instead of just describing it the same way, she describes it in terms of nature, like Kaya might. And I just think that it's rambly. I think it's a bit much. And honestly, at this point, I'm impatient. I want to know what's going on, and she's just taking her sweet time. And it's one of those moments where I feel like if you're going to keep a reader in suspense for the entire book and you're close to it, you shouldn't make me read like a lot of purple prose before we get there, because it's going to feel slow. So I just had some trouble with that personally, but it's not too bad. You can just let it wash over you. Keep reading. That's what I did. And there's a bias of town that was ignored. So the lawyer tried to say, look, the town's biased. We can't have this court, this trial here. And the judge is like, nah, it's fine. And it's mentioned that on the table is the death penalty, which is not good. That's a huge surprise for me. They might kill her if they find her guilty of Chase's murder. So the stakes are high, people. And she mentions that there's a cat in the courthouse called Sunday Justice who likes to sit on the windowsills, which is very cute. And at this point, you're like, what the heck is going on? And thank goodness we flash back to 1969. Kaya is looking on a beach for some mushrooms for a book that she's writing, her next book, and she runs into a drunk Chase. And long story short, he's really awful, and he tries to force himself on her. She fights back. She punches him in the jaw. He manages to get her pants down a bit, but she manages to get away. And she kicks him when he's down because she's so mad. And she runs away, and it's really uncomfortable. And honestly, one of the worst parts about it for me is that he calls her my marsh girl, which is really uncomfy, and I don't like that at all. But the fisherman saw it happen. When she's leaving, panicked, she realizes that some fishermen saw that happen, and that must be the motive that the fishermen dudes were talking about. And so we flash forward to 1970 to the court, time, and Eric, I'm honest, I don't know all the court words, so it's the prosecutor, I believe. Eric calls Rodney, the fisherman, who says that after she kicked him, she yelled, talk to me again and I'll kill you. So obviously that's the motive, right? That they're arguing she had. Her lawyer, Tom, stands up and asks, Rodney, you didn't see it happen, but could she have been defending herself? And Rodney says yes, because we just saw, her memory. 1969, flashback, I know, I understand. I understand we're jumping, but as a reader, it was satisfying that whenever there's something talked about in court, they immediately flash back to it. So 1969 flashback, and we get Kaya running away from that situation. We're still right back in the moment of her escaping from Chase. She realizes that he punched her in the eye at some point, and she remembers that he wore the shell necklace still. While he was trying to force himself on her, he was wearing the shell necklace that she gave him, which she remembers. And she thinks to herself that she can't go to the police because it'll just be her word against his, and he's a man, so they won't believe her. And she's the marsh girl, so of course they won't believe her. And her eye is starting to get swelled up, and she decides she's not going to go to the shack because he'll know where she is. And so she goes to the reading cabin, and she hunkers down there for a couple days, and she's so scared, and she realizes that she understands her mom now. She cries, and she goes, Mom, I understand why you left now. I get it. And it's really sad, and she stares at the fireflies and realizes that the female fireflies have it right, which if you remember from our first podcast, she watches the scene where the female fireflies eat their partners. And so she must be thinking, man, they do it right. I never want to have to deal with this, which is pretty bummer. Flash forward to 1970, and she mentions that basically her cell is really sad. We just realize that she's sad, and she says an Amanda Hamilton poem, and I'll read it to you. This poem has a title, which so far they haven't really, but this one has a title. It's called Broken Goal of Brandon Beach. Winged soul, you danced the skies, and startled dawn with shrilling cries. You followed sails and braved the sea, then caught the wind back to me. You broke your wing, it dragged the land, and etched your mark upon the sand. When feathers break, you cannot fly, but who decides the time to die? You disappeared, I know not where, but your wing marks still linger there. A broken heart cannot fly, but who decides the time to die? So it's eerily similar to her situation now, where she's just feeling caught and broken, and she's facing the death penalty, and it's just, it's really rough. I think that poem tells you exactly where she's feeling right now, and exactly what this chapter is like, where she describes how sad she is in her cell. So, let's run away from that and go to 1969 after the whole event. Her eye is still a little swollen, but she decides she's going to go back out, into the water and do her thing. And she sees Tate's boat there, and she tries to avoid him, but he sees her and he waves and he's like, Kaya, come here, let me tell you, let me show you this thing. I'm using a microscope and I can see all the amoebas or whatever, because he's, a nerd. And she boards the boat because she decides she can probably hide her eye. And she goes on there and she looks at the microscope and she's amazed and happy. And he finally realizes something's off, and he's like, hey, what happened? And through some implying and some discussion, she tells him basically that Chase did it, but she's not interested. Please don't do anything. It's fine. And he's upset about it. And obviously he clenches his fist. He gets mad, but he doesn't say anything because he doesn't want to scare her off or anything like that. And as she's leaving, he says, wait, here, you must be cold. Take my hat. And he takes off his, guess what? Red wool hat and tosses it at her. And laughing, she tosses it back to him, and he tosses it back to her, and she puts it on and goes home. You guys, the hat. The hat. Anyway, she goes home and she goes to the shack and she hears the sound of Chase's boat, and she goes, oh my God. So she hides, and he storms off the boat to her shack, and he's so angry. She knows that in her heart that he will not stop. She knows that in that altercation, she got the best of him. She kicked him while he was down, and this dude is not going to stop till he hurts her, and she knows that in her brain. So, It's 1970, and Tom is meeting with Kaya to tell her that, if you are declared guilty, you will die. So maybe you should take a plea. And she says, no, I am not taking a plea. I'm not spending any time in jail. I'm either dying or I'm free, and there's no jail time. I'm not staying in jail, which is, that seems correct for Kaya. I see that. And she gets taken back to her cell, and Jumpin' has given her some food to be delivered, which is so cute. And the cat comes in, Sunday Justice from before, and sleeps with her in her cell. And it's a sad scene because she is so lonely that she is so happy this cat is here. And it's just such a bummer, honestly. And she tells her guard, Jacob, who obviously is a nice dude and somewhat pities her, that she really likes the cat at night and please let him in. And he says, okay, Miss Kaya. And later that night he lets the cat in, and it's really sweet. And the next day Tate visits her and gives her a book. And he tells her that he's been feeding the gulls, which is really cute. And up until now, she's refused to see him. And she tells him, Tate, you just have to forget about me, okay? I am so different from you, and I'm more distrustful than ever. And she doesn't say that, but that's what I'm getting from her, is that this has just taught her that she should not ever trust anybody, and life is just the worst. So she's obviously not in the best place. But Tate is such a cutie. He's like, it's okay, I understand. And he obviously does not take that to heart and still loves her. Still 1970, they go to court, and she walks in, and Jumpin' is there, and Mabel is there, and she mentions that Jody is not there because she hasn't had the heart to write him and tell him that she's on trial for murder. And they talk about Chase's death and it being fall, and they talk about it being his fall, talking about it could have been an accident or it could have been a push. That's what the guy says on the stand. Her lawyer makes the argument that the fibers on Chase's jacket could have been there for years, and there's no physical evidence of this guy being shoved. There's no bruising on his body. So just so you know, the court stuff, I'm just going to blow through it because honestly, Kaya doesn't pay that close attention to it, and there's not even a lot of quotes. It's just tells us what's going on. So I'm just going to blow through it, kind of. It's slow moving, so we're just going to move past him. Now we're into 1969 again, and she is going to Jumpin's to check out the bus schedule because her publisher has written her to ask her to visit him because he's never met her before. And so she's looking at the bus schedule, and Jumpin notices the bruise, and she tells Jumpin what happened, like the full story. And it's really emotional and sad, but she mentions, like, I don't want to go to the police. And he says, well, if you have any more trouble, let me know. Like, I'll round up the boys. And it's very cute. So flash forward to 1970, because we're kind of getting like memories inside of court stuff anyway. Flash forward to 1970, we learned that there was no footsteps around the fire tower and there were no fingerprints. The sheriff claims to be an expert, but Tom, the lawyer, proves that the steps could have been washed away by the tide, and there's technically no evidence that they were covered either. So there's no evidence right now that there was foul play, basically. We also learned that there was no hair at the scene, and Kaya has really long hair. Like, wouldn't her hair have fallen off or out somewhere? And the sheriff says, but that's not, here or there. And then Tom says, yeah, but sheriff, didn't you write a notice of how dangerous those grates were just months before? And the sheriff's like, I guess. And this is mind-blowing to me. This was a moment where I was like, whoa, because we had never seen this before. The sheriff had written a letter to the city or the state or whatever, saying that the fire tower was a hazard because the grates could easily be open and anyone could fall. And that's where we end that little chapter. And we're back to 1969, where she says bye to Jumpin, and she gets on the bus. And then we're told 2 days later, she comes home, and Jumpin tells her that Chase has died, and she seems very shocked, and he looks deep in her eyes, and she says an Amanda Hamilton poem that I'm going to read to you. Now, just to remind you, she doesn't say this to Jumpin, she's just thinking it. She says, never underrate the heart. Capable of deeds the mind cannot conceive. The heart dictates as well as feels. How else can you explain the path I have taken, that you have taken, the long way through this pass? So, haunting. Okay, yay, now we're in 1970 and we don't have any more flashbacks. So for the rest of the story, it's all one timeline, which is kind of nice. No more jumping around. Basically, we get these two, testimonies from the bus drivers. They claim that while the schedules could have worked that night, neither driver saw her on the drives that would have required her to be in town for the night. One of them saw a skinny man that could have been a disguise, and the other saw a grandma that could also be a disguise, which I feel like is obviously far-fetched. Like, what? After that, Chase's wife takes the stand, and she tells how Chase's necklace was something he wore all the time. And this was obviously the prosecution trying to prove that the necklace being gone was an important thing, because they take out this book that his wife had found and presents, drawings that Kaya had made of their relationship. So one of the drawings is of her giving him the shell necklace as evidence that it was from her. This section's really rambling, and there's more court testimonies that I'm just going to tell you right now. So next is Hal, one of the people who talked to the sheriff, who said that he saw her in a boat going towards the fire tower. But Tom, her lawyer, mentions, how do you know it was her? It was really dark. You said it was like really dark outside. Could you recognize her shape? And he said, yes. I've always recognized the shape of those boats, which is like not very good. We also have a testimony from Mrs. Singletary, who is, if you remember in the last episode at the very beginning, the woman who would check out Kaya from the Piggly Wiggly grocery store. Apparently we learned that she used to give her little pieces of her own money because Kaya couldn't count, so she would sneak in a dime or a nickel here and there, which is really sweet. She mentions that she saw Kaya return from the bus and that her alibi is strong. The sad thing about this, though, is that the prosecution says, yeah, we don't deny that that's her alibi. And it's like, oh, dang, now her alibi almost has no leg to stand on because they're arguing that the alibi works for their case. So that sucks. They have another guy who mentions, the guy who mans the motel where she stayed in Greenville, says that he never saw her leave. So, The next scene is of Scupper's point of view, who is Tate's father. He says that he joins the courtroom with Tate. He was ashamed that he wasn't being more supporting of his relationship with the Marsh girl. He realizes that, it's probably just some sort of bias he has against her, and if Tate's happy, he's happy. So he sits next to him, which is really nice. The next court testimony is from her editor, who says they had dinner and that she requested to be put in that motel. Tom mentions that is it just more likely she requested that hotel because it's on the outskirts of town and she's shy and because it's close to the bus where she'll have to drive home. And the editor says, yes. Now, there's a memory here Kaya has about being on a picnic with Tate, which is like nice, I guess. It's just kind of there, just being on a picnic with Tate. And then they take a break because Kaya has like a moment of not feeling good, which is sad. After that break, this is where Tom mentions to, the sheriff that timing wise, it almost wouldn't work out. Like the bus schedules combined with her requiring to be at the fire tower at a certain time would mean that she had to run, and there would have to be a riptide that night to get her to the tower because she needed an extra 20 minutes. Do they know if a riptide happened that night? And the sheriff says no. So, cut that apart. And eventually they have their recaps. So Eric, the prosecution, says, you need to get this girl. Like, obviously this is something that happened. Like, do your duty. And Tom's is nice. He takes off his little glasses and says, listen, everyone, this is the Marsh Girl, right? Like, we all know her as the Marsh Girl, and we've all pushed her away for years. But please look at this case. There's no evidence, and it's time to be nice to the Marsh Girl. And the jury goes to deliberate. So some of my thoughts about this court scene, you guys, it might be that before this book, we read To Kill a Mockingbird, which is also a court book. Like, it takes place, there's a scene with court. And to be honest, I like the Mockingbird way of doing it more than Delia Owens because, like I said, Kaya's kind of in and out for the situation, and I wish we were seeing it all. And I don't know, it's well done, but it's a bit rambly because a lot of it's in her head and whatever, and it's well done in the fact that we learn new information. I just think it's honestly a little slow. And so while it's good, it's the most maybe important piece of the novel where I learn the most information, and it's slower than the rest of the novel. So it was just a teeny bit frustrating for me as a reader, but it's not that bad. I still had a good time reading it, and it was still well done in the fact that like all the facts line up in a certain way. And as a reader, I'm honestly starting to feel like this is an accident. I don't know where you guys were or are right now, but right now, as a reader, I was feeling like this was probably an accident. Like the evidence, quote unquote, that they have is ridiculous. Anyway, while the jury's deliberating, I forgot to tell you guys that Jody has shown up. So someone let him know that this was happening, and he shows up to support her, and she like tears up, which is really, really cute. And they wait together. Him and Tate's dad and Mabel and Jumpin wait outside because they're not allowed to be in there. And they wait for the jury to come to a decision. It takes a while, but eventually they do. And they come out and they don't look at her. And I'm like really stressed out because I just read Mockingbird where it said that if they don't look at you, you're guilty. And they announced not guilty of all charges. And listen, guys, listen. I'm happy. Don't get me wrong. I'm happy that she didn't get charged. But I found it kind of hard to believe, and maybe it's because I just read Mockingbird, but I found it hard to believe that this town, after the prejudices, would let her go. Like, I just found it a little difficult to believe, but I was still very happy that she did not get the death penalty. So that's good. Yay, finally. Jody drives her home from jail, which gotta suck. But he drives her home and he fixes her dinner, and the whole time she's like she pushes him away with her words, and she's upset at the world and people, obviously. But Jody's trying to argue for the town. He's like, look, maybe this is their way of saying that they at least accept you a bit more. Like, they're trying not to be mean to you outwardly. And she hides until he leaves, and she comes home, and she doesn't understand why she's so upset or why she was so mad at Jody, but she's just in inner turmoil at the moment. We skip ahead to another scene, and Kaya sees the sheriff pull up to Tate while he's in the water area, the marsh, right? And I guess she was watching him, and the sheriff pulls up to him. Tate looks sad, and he gets on board of the boat. And I think this is supposed to give us like a, why are they taking him moment? But we immediately learn that Scupper, his dad, has died. While he's at the funeral, he decides he's had enough of this, and he goes to Kaya's place, and he's like, Kaya, look, I love you. You love me. We should be together. And they get together, which honestly feels really easy for me. And I was a little disappointed with that scene because this whole book, we've been like, oh, Tate and Kaya, meh. And all in like literally a couple sentences, he like pulls her into his grasp and like very easily gets it done. And it's not even from like Kaya's mind. Like, I don't even get to see what she's thinking. I was just like, ugh, why? But whatever. Life moves on, and like one day he asks her if they're going to get married, and she says, "We are married, like the geese," which is very cute. And time keeps going on, and everyone agrees after a while in the town that Kaya definitely didn't do it, right? Like whatever they had found, it was obviously a mistake. Like everyone understands that that case was obviously not her bad. Like everyone agrees with the consensus. Time moves forward again, and one day Jumpin dies, and she doesn't go to the funeral because she doesn't like people, but she does see Mabel, and Mabel cries and gives her a hug and says he loves you like his own daughter, and it's very heartwarming. And to be quite honest, in my brain reading this, I'm like, why are we still talking? Like, what is the end of the book? Where are you taking me? Like, I'm just skipping through time, everyone's dying. I'm like, what is going on here? But you'll see. Let's go. Anyway, she talks about how Barkley Cove changes. She talks about how she and Tate never have a child. And at 64, Kaya is, out on the marsh, and Tate finds her slumped over in her boat, and she has died, which at 64 is not very old, but she's dead. And he has her buried in the marsh. He got special, permission to bury her there, and they have a small ceremony, and her little headstone says, Kaya, quote unquote, the marsh girl, which is very cute. And after that funeral, he goes inside and he's putting some wood in the wooden stove, and he sees that despite all the changes of the house, the wood stove was never changed because of her mom, which was very sweet. But where the wood normally is, there's actually a trap door, and he opens it up, and there are a lot of poems written by Amanda Hamilton, but they're sketches, and he realizes that Kaya was Amanda Hamilton. She had been published in the newspaper a couple times, and he never knew it was her. And there is one poem called Firefly that I'm going to read to you. Luring him was as easy as flashing valentines, but like a lady firefly, they hid a secret call to die. A final touch, unfinished, the last step, a trap. Down, down he falls, his eyes still holding mine, until they see another world. I saw them change, first a question, then an answer, finally an end, and love itself passing to whatever it was before it began, A.H. He then kneels further down, and he finds Chase's shell necklace. He burns the poems in the wooden stove, and he walks out to the sea and drops the necklace to, blend in with the rest of the shells on the beach. And as he's walking back into his shack, here are the final lines of the book. Are you ready? Then the gulls came. Seeing him there, they spiraled above his head, calling, calling. As night fell, Tate walked back toward the shack. But when he reached the lagoon, he stopped under the deep canopy and watched hundreds of fireflies beckoning far into the dark reaches of the marsh, way out yonder, where the crawdads sing. And that's the end. That's the end. So that's the end, you guys. That's the end. Oh my God, I had so many thoughts about the end. Like, I think you should take a second and think about it before I talk to you about it. So maybe take a little second here. Okay, do you know how you feel about it? Because I know how I felt about it. You guys, okay, here's the thing, all right? If you like the ending, I totally understand. She answers the mystery, and all of the facts add up together, and it's kind of one of those things where you go, oh, of course. And so it answers it. And I think that makes complete sense. If you like the ending, it's written well. I understand. I personally did not like it. I'm going to tell you why. I didn't like it because I didn't like the way it painted Kaya. Kaya is our gentle marsh girl, and for this murder to have worked, she had it so planned out that it makes me uncomfortable. She wore disguises, you guys. She had to go buy a wig to look like a grandmother so she could ride on the bus and have the bus drivers not see her. And that premeditation makes me extremely uncomfortable, especially with a character that up until now I've really enjoyed. And I don't know, I was hoping it was an accident. And along the way, Delia makes you feel like it might be Tate, but I know it can't be because he hands the cap to Kaya before Chase dies. And at that point, as a reader, for me, I knew it was probably her, but then I was like, oh, maybe it's an accident. But the lawyer makes that argument where the fibers could have been there for years, and it's not possible because Tate just gave her the hat. So I knew it was probably her. It wasn't that big of a surprise to me as a reader, but it did make me sad because I was like, no, like I didn't want it to be her because I get why she killed him. If she didn't kill him, he would have killed her probably, right? Like I get that. It's just the premeditation that makes me uncomfortable. And then something else that makes me uncomfortable, you guys. Here's a crazy fact. Delia Owens and her family were embroiled in a murder trial when they lived in, I believe, Africa because some poachers were killed and her stepson was thought to be involved. So, and they didn't get away with it because I didn't look that closely at the trial. So it's possible he didn't have anything to do with it. But the fact she was in a murder trial and her son was in a murder trial, and then she wrote a story about justified murder makes me a little uncomfortable. Like that changes the tone of it for me, just like a teeny bit. And I personally didn't like it. Here's a couple of things that I personally didn't enjoy. I didn't enjoy the fact that once the story ends, we have that whole bit where I don't know why I'm reading. A lot of stories seem to have that. Like, I don't know why I'm reading anymore. You finish the trial, nothing is happening. I'm moving through time quickly. Like, what are you trying to show me? And it's one of those things where like, I don't need to know. Like at the end of the book, I think she could have ended it with Tate and Kaya getting together. I think some people would have been curious, but in my opinion, I think it would have opened up lots of fun discussions. A lot of books that have discussions are books that are really ambiguous with what went on and like what happened and the point of view. So like Mockingbird kind of does that, where at the end you aren't sure if, technically Jed killed that guy or if it was Boo. I'm assuming it's Boo, but she didn't see, so it's possible, right? It's one of those things where I like ambiguity in a story, and this ending just kind of disappointed me. I didn't want it to be Kaya. It makes me a little uncomfortable. How it is I think I felt the hand of the author. So when I was reading this book this whole time, I never felt Owen's presence. And maybe that's like a weird me thing that other people don't notice. But sometimes choices or sentences are put into books that I know, like I feel the author put there because they want me to know something. So Wonder did that a lot, where it was like, I know it's only summer. And I'm like, oh, so that's from the author to tell me that it's summertime, right? Like there's certain things that authors put in books that I can feel their presence. I didn't feel Delia's presence this entire book. It was so good. I was so entrenched in the story and like I was just enthralled. And at the very end, I felt her here. I felt her going, okay, what would make a fun ending? And then she put this here. And I was like, okay, like, I get it. It's just that for me, as a picky reader, I saw it coming and I didn't want it to come. And maybe that's the point. Maybe she wanted to write a character that you still like, even though they like totally killed somebody, because that's justified homicide or whatever. But it's just that for me, I felt like this book could have ended on a tone of uncertainty, and I still think it would have been just as good. I think if you had not told us that ending, I think most of us would have come to that conclusion on our own. Like I said, it's one of those things like the hat itself, the way it worked and what we know, I think would have let us know that she probably killed him. And even then, if you had just put the poem at the end instead of the necklace, I also would have got it. But it felt almost like overkill. Like it felt too serendipitous that he finds it and she's hidden it away. And like, I don't know, like I knew something was going to happen at the end because we had to sit through all the boring stuff. It felt honestly, I don't want to be mean. It felt a little pandering. So I felt like she was just appealing to me as a reader on purpose. And I just wish she hadn't. I wish that, I think that the book would have been just as good if she had left it as a mystery, But that might just be me. I can totally see why this ending might appeal to a lot of people who love mysteries and wanted to know it was her and thought it was her the whole time. Or people who love twists and didn't know it was going to be her. Like, I can totally see that. It's just that for me personally, I personally would not have made that choice. But here's the thing. I've never written a book. Writing a book is hard, and she did great otherwise. I think this book still makes it to my favorites list. It's just that until that moment, I was so in love with this book, and then it ended that way, and I was like, oh, dang, like this ended in such a boring way. Like it ended in a way that went just the way I thought. It was one of those things where you're watching a TV show and it's like, oh, the spouse always does it, and then it leads you on like a merry chase, and at the end it was the spouse. I'm like, what? Like that's exactly what I was expecting, and you made me sit around for like this entire time. And then we found out it was her. Like, I don't know. When I found out there's a murder, I went, oh, did she do it? And this whole time did she do it? And then I was like, I don't know. And then we got to the end and I was like, oh, she did it. And I was like, okay, well, but I understand, like I said, I understand why she made that choice. All in all, I did really like the book. I like her writing. I like the way she structures the plot with the timelines. I think it really kept me going. I love the characters. I like Kaya way less now, but I still really like Tate. I really like Jumpin' and Mabel. I like the lawyer who helps her out. Anyway, like I said, I think this still makes it to one of my top favorite books. And, I can tell you a little bit more about the title. You might not know much about that, why it's called Where the Crawdads Sing, if you didn't make the connection. For me, I made the connection a while back. It's mentioned in the first half of the book, in the first episode of the podcast. It mentions that where the crawdads sing are where all the very wild things live. And I think that is Kaya. Like, Kaya to people is where the crawdads sing. Like, that's where she lives. In her heart, she lives where the crawdads sing. She lives in the wild and with the wilderness and one with nature. And no one else can really understand that and like see it the way that Kaya did the entire book. So when he listens to where the crawdad sings and like looks out to where they sing, I think he's thinking of Kaya and where she is now, which is one with the earth and one with nature. So that's how I would think of the title. Oh, other thought that I had would be the Amanda Hamilton poems. So personally, the Hamilton poems, that was a cool reveal because I honestly didn't see that coming. That was cool that she wrote that, but I feel a little bad because there were so many Amanda Hamilton. I only read a little bit of them to you. There were so many Amanda Hamilton poems that after a while, my eyes just literally glossed over them. I think they were a teeny bit overdone, but I think at the end they worked well, and I liked the one when she was in her prison cell with the gulls, and for the most part, I think it worked well as a device to give us a surprise about Kaya that was good, and then to give us a surprise about Kaya that was bad. That's the book. I mean, it's whatever you want to think about it. I think this one would be a really big divider among people about whether you like it or whether you don't, because there's lots of purple prose and there's lots of there's the whole justified murder thing. And so if you're willing to set aside and suspend your belief for a time and just enjoy the book for what it gives you and then just live in the ride, then I think that you'd enjoy the book. And by me telling you the end, I'm not saying you shouldn't read it. Maybe you still do, because I tried to read more excerpts here because I think this book, a lot of its character come from its writing style. So if you're still interested, I would definitely recommend this as a read. I would give it maybe like a 4 out of 5 stars, and that 1 star is just because of the last 3 pages. So really, if you read a 390-page book and the last 3 pages don't do it for you, like, that's still a pretty good ratio, right? And just to give this book another pro before we head out, I really like the female experience that it gives us. Like, Kaya's eyes and the whole female experience and what it's like to deal with the boy world without knowing about it. Like, obviously I can't relate. I didn't grow up in a marsh, but it's cute because I think she writes well, and I like that she represents Kaya in a way where she really just wants to be loved, and I think that a lot of women and men can relate to that. So the human experience with love, I think that's all so well written, and that's why this book was so good for me to read. Just while I was reading it, I loved it so much because I felt like it was so weirdly relatable, despite the fact that our lives are totally different. I did not grow up in the 50s in a marsh, although sometimes I wish I did, because that sounds like a lot of fun. Too bad I'm afraid of spiders, right? Anyway, thank you so much for listening to me, everybody. I had the best time talking to you about this book. Go ahead and read it one weekend. I think you'll enjoy it, at least for the experience. And join me next week to talk about I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, another singing novel, which was on accident, but it's by Maya Angelou. It'll be our first nonfiction book, which will be really fun. If you want more Bad Book Club, you can find us on our socials at Bad Book Club Pod on everything. And if you want to support the podcast, you can always buy one of the books that I talk about from the link below, and you'll support a local bookstore at the same time, which is super fun. Anyway, thank you for tuning in. Love you guys. Bye.